The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared this week that it broke the blockade. Those were the exact words from IRG commanders broadcasting through state-affiliated media to an Iranian population that has had its internet shut down for nearly 2 months and cannot independently verify anything the regime tells it. We broke the blockade. And the proof of this strategic victory, the evidence that the most powerful naval force on earth had been defeated by Iranian ingenuity, is this. Pakistan agreed to let Iranian cargo move through 6 official land routes across Baluchistan's rugged terrain at a cost of 10 to 12 times what maritime shipping costs per unit of cargo, through mountainous roads riddled with active insurgent operations by the Baluchistan Liberation Army, requiring bank guarantees and bureaucratic procedures at border crossings that take days or weeks to clear per container, while thousands of containers remain stuck at Pakistani ports unable to move forward. That is the broken blockade. That is the strategic victory. And while the official land corridor was still producing its press releases, 5 to 6 million liters of Iranian subsidized fuel were crossing the border every day on motorcycles, pickups, and small boats through informal crossing points that no IRG checkpoint is staffing and no customs officer is recording, carried by smugglers, who have discovered that the price differential between Iran's subsidized fuel and Pakistan's market price creates a profit margin so large that no level of state prohibition could stop them. The IRG said it broke the blockade. What it actually did was lose control of its own border. And the question that the regime's propaganda apparatus is not equipped to answer is how you claim a strategic victory when your victory looks like motorcycle convoys kicking up dust on desert roads while your oil wells are on the verge of shutting down and your enemy still controls the sea. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why the IRG's land corridor claim is the most revealing piece of self-description the regime has produced since this conflict began, you need to understand exactly what the U.S. Navy blockade did to Iran's logistical system when it shut down Iranian ports starting April 13, 2026, how the cascade of consequences from that single operational decision forced the regime into the Pakistani land bridge in the first place, and why the land bridge that was supposed to provide relief is instead adding new dimensions of financial drain, security exposure, political dependence, and strategic vulnerability to a regime that was already being crushed along every other pressure axis simultaneously. Here is where we stand. When the U.S. Navy effectively shut down Iranian ports on April 13, 2026, it triggered a devastating wave of logistical chaos inside Iran that proved nearly impossible to absorb. The mechanism was straightforward and its consequences were immediate. Ships can no longer dock at Iranian ports. Cargo that was in transit when the blockade tightened is jammed into locations simultaneously at sea on vessels that have nowhere to dock and nowhere to deliver. And on the Pakistani side of the border at the ports of Karachi and Gwadar, where according to Al Jazeera's April 24th report, more than 3,000 containers are waiting with nowhere to go. Cranes at those ports are idle, warehouses are filling, port workers are without income. The local Pakistani economy around the ports has contracted because the cargo movement that generates economic activity has stopped. Inside Iran, the oil storage facilities have filled to capacity. Every barrel produced that cannot be exported sits in tanks that are approaching their physical ceiling. When the tanks reach capacity, production cannot continue unless the oil has somewhere to go. And when production cannot continue, the consequences are not a policy problem. They are a physics problem. The pressure balances that keep oil wells productive begin to deteriorate when wells are shut in. Reservoir water seeps into oil bearing. Rock formations, poor structures collapse. Some wells that are shut in under these conditions never fully recover their productive capacity. This is the specific catastrophe that the land corridor was supposed to prevent, keeping enough logistical throughput alive to avoid the forced well shutdown that permanent geological damage makes irreversible. The regime turned to Pakistan in this moment of desperation, the same Pakistan it had belittled for years, the same neighbor it had treated as a junior regional actor unworthy of genuine partnership, became the only available land bridge when the maritime option was sealed. Pakistan's government responded with the transit of goods through territory of Pakistan Order 2026, enacted on April 25, 2026, establishing 6 official land routes connecting Iranian cargo to the Pakistani port system. The IRG immediately converted this administrative order from a neighboring government into a propaganda victory, claiming it had broken the American blockade through Iranian strategic brilliance and Pakistani solidarity. The claim was both factually incorrect and strategically revealing. Factually incorrect because a land bridge through Baluchistan at 10 times the maritime cost with 3,000 containers still stuck at Pakistani ports is not a broken blockade. It is a blockade with a slow, expensive leak that does not come close to replacing maritime throughput, and strategically revealing because the willingness to make the claim, to call the motorcycle convoys a strategic victory, tells you how completely the regime's internal political calculus has decoupled from external operational reality. The IRG needs its domestic audience to believe the blockade is being defeated. The domestic audience cannot independently verify the claim because the internet is shut down. So the claim is made, and the fact that it cannot survive contact with any externally verifiable data point is irrelevant to its domestic political function. Let me give you the operational reality of those 6 official routes with the precision their geography demands, because most coverage has treated them as a generic land route concept rather than examining the specific terrain, security conditions, and logistical constraints of each corridor that make the official routes collectively. Inadequate as maritime substitutes, the first route runs from Gwadar to the Gabd border crossing, the shortest official line, but full of rugged terrain and documented security risks along every kilometer. The second runs from Karachi through Ormara and Pasni to Gabd, following the coastline but multiplying the logistics burden at mountain passes that create choke points for heavy cargo trucks. The third route heads inland through Kozdar and Dalband into Taftan, creating heavy distance loads and passing through territory where BLA operations have been documented. The fourth and fifth routes form the longest and heaviest transportation chains, running from Gwadar through Turbat, Hashab, Panjur, Nag, Basima, and Kozdar through Quetta to Taftan. The sixth route attempts to simplify interport transit through a Karachi-Gwadar-Gabd combination. Every single one of these 6 routes shares 3 characteristics that collectively make them inadequate replacements for maritime trade. They pass through Baluchistan's rugged terrain, they carry serious security risks from the BLA's active operations throughout the region, and they operate at a cost structure that is 10 to 12 times more expensive than maritime shipping per equivalent unit of cargo. To move what a single tanker carries in one voyage, you need hundreds of trucks, each requiring a driver, fuel for the entire desert and mountain route, security escort through BLA operating territory, and the time to navigate customs procedures at border crossings where each container requires bank guarantees and Federal Board of Revenue procedures that take days or weeks to process. The official land corridor is not a blockade breaker. It is a financially ruinous, logistically insufficient, security-compromised emergency measure that the regime is marketing as a victory precisely because it has nothing else to show its population. Now let me show you the smuggling dimension in the full detail that reveals what the official corridor's inadequacy has produced in the informal economy at the border, because this is the story that carries the most operational significance for understanding what the blockade has actually done to the regime's border control capacity and to its financial position simultaneously. Before the official routes were even cleared of their bureaucratic obstacles, a parallel economy had already exploded across the same border. Since April 25th, videos circulating on social media, moving through channels that the internet shutdown cannot fully seal because Starlink access and encrypted messaging continue to provide information corridors that the regime cannot completely close, show hundreds of motorcycles advancing from Iran into Pakistan across Baluchistan's desert terrain. Footage from May 3rd confirms long queues forming at informal crossing points. These convoys, kicking up dust clouds on desert roads, represent a physical contradiction of everything the IRG has claimed about its border control capacity. According to Deutsche Welle's Baluchistan smuggling report, 5 to 6 million liters of Iranian fuel are crossing into Pakistan through these informal routes every single day. The mechanism is economically driven and operationally simple. Iran's government subsidizes fuel prices to near zero as a domestic social welfare measure. The market price of the same fuel in Pakistan is more than double. Every liter that crosses the border generates a profit margin that requires no sophisticated criminal infrastructure to exploit. Motorcycles, pickup trucks, and small boats along border waterways carry the maximum fuel quantity that their capacity allows, cross at one of hundreds of informal paths through the desert and mountain terrain that the border region's geography provides, and sell at Pakistani market price. The operation runs faster and at lower cost than the official corridor. While official trucks wait for days at customs processing, motorcycle smugglers complete the same fuel delivery in hours. The official route is expensive and slow, smuggling is fast and profitable, and the volume of informal trade has completely overshadowed the official corridor in terms of both speed and practical impact on the fuel. Reaching Pakistani markets, the scale of the smuggling's financial consequence for the Iranian regime cannot be overstated. 5 to 6 million liters crossing the border daily represents an enormous daily loss from Iran's subsidized fuel stockpiles. This fuel was purchased by the Iranian government at subsidized rates, meaning the state absorbed the cost of producing and distributing it. When it crosses the border through informal routes, the state collects nothing from the sale. The profit goes to the smuggling networks, the tribal facilitators on the Pakistani side, and whatever portion of the Pakistani security forces who are receiving payments to look the other way. None of it reaches the Iranian treasury. All of it depletes Iranian fuel stocks that the regime needs for its own population, its own logistics, and its own military operations. The IRG is filing report after report to Tehran about the smuggling. Its capacity to stop it has already effectively vanished. The border region's geography, with hundreds of informal crossing paths through mountainous and desert terrain, provides more access points than the IRG can monitor, particularly when the organization's resources are simultaneously being consumed by the Hormuz confrontation, the domestic repression campaign, and the emergency logistics. Response to the blockade: the regime blames the smuggling on foreign agents. The more accurate explanation is that it is the entirely predictable consequence of creating a massive price differential at a border that cannot be effectively sealed. Let me address Pakistan's strategic calculation in this situation at the depth it requires, because Pakistan's role in this story is not the story of a sympathetic neighbor providing humanitarian assistance to an ally in crisis. It is the story of a sophisticated regional actor executing a multi-layered strategy that simultaneously extracts maximum value from Iran's desperation, strengthens its own regional logistics infrastructure, manages its relationships with the United States and Gulf states, and reduces domestic political pressure in Baluchistan by allowing cheap Iranian fuel to flow into the province's economy. According to Al Jazeera's April 30th analysis, Pakistan is not content with simple transit fees and logistics revenue from the official corridor. Through the revival of Gwadar port as an active cargo hub, Pakistan is strengthening the China-Pakistan economic corridor infrastructure that it has been building for years with Chinese investment, and that the Iranian cargo emergency has now given new operational justification and volume. Every container moving through official channels generates transit revenue for the Pakistani government and port activity for Pakistani workers. The smuggling networks, which Pakistan's security forces in Baluchistan are alleged to be monitoring with selective enforcement that amounts to looking the other way, generate informal economic activity in a province where poverty and the Blah insurgency create continuous governance challenges. A complete crackdown on the smuggling would remove the cheap fuel that sustains thousands of Baloch families and could trigger social unrest that Pakistan's government is not equipped to manage alongside everything else it is dealing with. The tolerance for smuggling is not a failure of governance. It is a governance choice that serves multiple Pakistani interests simultaneously while maintaining deniability. Pakistan is simultaneously earning diplomatic points by appearing to assist Iran, maintaining domestic popularity in Baluchistan through the cheap fuel benefit, gaining geopolitical leverage by creating an Iranian dependency on Pakistani territory while remaining visibly aligned with the United States and Gulf states, and protecting China's CPEC investments by keeping Gwadar active. Iran is being used by Pakistan as a tool for Pakistani strategic objectives. The relationship that Tehran imagined as solidarity is being operated by Islamabad as extraction. Every truck that moves through the official corridor costs Iran 10 times more than maritime shipping while generating revenue for Pakistan. Every motorcycle that crosses informally costs Iran fuel stockpiles while generating economic activity in Pakistani Baluchistan. Iran's desperation is Pakistan's opportunity, and the regime that spent years treating Pakistan as a junior regional actor is now entirely structurally dependent on Pakistani tolerance for its emergency logistics survival. Now let me give you the Blah security dimension in the operational detail that makes it the most dangerous unresolved variable in the entire land corridor picture. The Baluchistan Liberation Army is not a marginal insurgent group that can be managed through standard counterinsurgency operations while simultaneously running a high-volume cargo corridor through its operating territory. According to Special Eurasia's assessment, the Blah struck 18 separate points in coordinated attacks in early 2026, mobilizing around 500 militants in a coordinated operational pattern that demonstrates organizational capacity well beyond the kind of single-incident activity that security forces can dismiss as manageable. The critical geographical detail is that Gwadar, Turbat, Taftan, and Quetta, the exact nodes and transit cities that the 6 official land routes pass through, are already sensitive zones from Blah's documented past operational history. The organization's stated position on the Iran-Pakistan land corridor, confirmed in the New York Times' May 3 reporting, is that it views both Pakistani cooperation with Iran and Iranian cargo movement as extensions of the CPEC project that the Blah has been targeting as a symbol of what it characterizes as Chinese and Pakistani occupation of Baloch territory. The Blah has been assessed as having the operational capability to target bridges, fuel depots, and cargo convoys with improvised explosive devices along the exact route segments where the official corridors are most geographically constrained and most difficult to provide effective security coverage for. In the event of a successful large-scale convoy seizure or a sustained bridge and depot attack campaign, cargo worth thousands of containers could fall into insurgent hands or be destroyed, representing a combined loss of material value, logistical capacity, and regime prestige that compounds every other pressure dimension the IRG is managing simultaneously. The regime's response to the Blah threat has been to attempt to deploy IRG resources to provide force protection for convoys operating in Pakistani territory. This deployment requires Pakistani government cooperation that is provided selectively and at a price, exposes IRG personnel to the hostile security environment that the Blah operates in throughout the corridor, and consumes IRG resources, financial, personnel, and logistical, that are already stretched by the maritime confrontation. The domestic repression and the economic emergency, every IRG resource committed to Baluchistan convoy protection is a resource not available for the other crisis dimensions the organization is managing. The convoy protection requirement is not a temporary security arrangement that will stabilize as the corridor matures. It is a permanent operational tax on IRG capacity that increases as the Blah adjusts its targeting to the new logistical geography the corridor creates. Let me address the human infrastructure of the corridor with the attention it deserves, because the truck drivers who are being expected to operate the official land routes are a politically significant constituency whose breaking point has already been demonstrated. These are the same truck drivers who shut down roads in 40 Iranian cities in 2025 over low wages, quota restrictions, and insurance problems that the regime's logistical management had created and refused to address. The 2025 shutdown demonstrated that Iran's truck driver workforce has both the organizational capacity to conduct coordinated nationwide action and the willingness to do so when economic conditions cross the threshold of tolerability. The official land corridor through Baluchistan is being asked of this workforce under conditions that are worse in every measurable dimension than the conditions that produced the 2025 shutdown. The routes are longer, the terrain is more demanding, the security risks are higher, the bureaucratic procedures at border crossings create extended waiting periods with no income generation, spare parts shortages at Pakistani crossings leave trucks stranded with breakdown costs that fall on drivers. The IRG's response to driver reluctance is to pressure workforce compliance through a combination of patriotic framing, calling truck drivers logistics heroes of the resistance, and implicit coercive authority. Neither instrument is producing reliable compliance from a workforce that has already demonstrated its willingness to shut down 40 cities rather than absorb unsustainable conditions. The pressure point is real and proximate. Iran's official land corridor depends on the willing participation of a workforce that has already demonstrated its breaking point and that is being asked to cross it again under worse conditions than the ones that produced the previous shutdown. A coordinated truck driver withdrawal from the Baluchistan routes would collapse the official corridor's throughput capacity without any external action required. The regime's own logistics workers have the capacity to close the escape valve that the land corridor represents. Now let me give you the American strategic dimension of the land corridor, because Washington's decision not to block the Pakistani land routes directly is the most analytically sophisticated element of the entire corridor picture and the one that is most frequently misread as a gap in American enforcement capability. The United States has not placed direct operational obstacles on the official Iran-Pakistan land routes. This is a strategic choice, not an oversight. The land corridor operates entirely within the permissive space that Washington has chosen to provide, and that permissive space exists because allowing the corridor to operate under its current conditions serves American strategic interests in ways that blocking it immediately would not. The corridor moves cargo at 10 to 12 times maritime cost. Every container that moves through Baluchistan instead of through maritime trade at 10 times the cost is accelerating the financial drain on the Iranian regime rather than relieving it. The land corridor is not substituting for maritime revenue. It is substituting for it at a cost structure that amplifies financial pressure rather than reducing it. Every dollar of revenue that moves through the land corridor costs Iran $10 to $12 of logistics expense to generate it. Washington's decision to allow this arrangement is the decision to let the regime's own emergency measure accelerate its own financial collapse. Beyond the cost structure benefit, the United States maintains monitoring capacity over every convoy and logistics node inside Iranian territory that the land routes use. American satellite, signals intelligence, and airborne surveillance assets track every significant vehicle movement inside Iran continuously. The data from monitoring the land corridor convoys provides American targeters with a continuously updated picture of where critical logistical infrastructure, bridge nodes, mountain pass segments, fuel depot locations, is concentrated and how dependent the Iranian system has become on specific choke points. Washington can shut down the routes by pressuring Pakistan through diplomatic and financial channels at any moment the strategic calculation changes. Pakistan's economic dependency on American financial relationships and Gulf state partnerships makes it highly susceptible to American pressure on corridor tolerance if Washington decides to apply it, or, as Trump's own statements explicitly previewed when he described the option of hitting every bridge and power plant, a single strike on a strategic bridge in the mountainous terrain of eastern Iran would eliminate the throughput of the most constrained corridor segment without requiring sustained interdiction of individual convoys. One strike, one bridge. The entire land corridor throughput collapses through the choke point below the bridge without American forces needing to engage the convoys themselves. The land corridor is an American option. Iran is using it as a lifeline. The distinction between those two descriptions is the difference between a corridor that the regime controls and a corridor that exists at American discretion. The regime controls none of it. Now let me bring the way's Fujairah pipeline into the complete picture, because the Fujairah dimension transforms the land corridor's inadequacy from a tactical logistics problem into a permanent strategic defeat. The way activated the ADCO pipeline connecting Abu Dhabi's Habshan oil fields to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman at full capacity during this conflict. This approximately 400-kilometer infrastructure project moves roughly 1.8 million barrels of oil per day completely outside the Strait of Hormuz's navigational corridor, completely outside the IRG's fast attack boat operational envelope, completely outside the range of the mines the IRG has been laying in the strait during the ceasefire period, and completely under the protective umbrella of the American Fifth Fleet operating in the wider waters of the Gulf of Oman. The Fujairah pipeline's strategic significance goes far beyond the oil it moves. It invalidates the doctrine. Iran's threat to close the Strait of Hormuz operated on the assumption that Gulf oil had no alternative exit route and that a strait closure would therefore impose unbearable economic pain on the way's energy export revenue and on the global buyers who depended on way supply. The Fujairah pipeline eliminates that assumption completely. For whey production, the IRG's coastal defense systems, the anti-ship missiles deployed along the Iranian coastline, the fast attack boats, the mining operations in the Strait's narrow waters, none of them can reach the tankers loading at Fujairah. The defensive investment of billions of dollars that Iran poured into coastal defense systems designed to threaten Strait traffic has been rendered operationally irrelevant against whey oil exports by a 400-kilometer pipeline on the other side of the Omani coast, and the asymmetric transformation this produces is the most strategically significant consequence of the Fujairah pipeline for the regime's long-term power projection. Any future crisis in the Strait of Hormuz will impose costs on Iran rather than on the whey, because the whey has an alternative export route and Iran does not. Iran's own oil is trapped in the strait, accumulating in storage tanks approaching their ceiling, while whey crude flows freely to Fujairah for loading onto tankers that operate in waters where the IRG has no reach. The strait that the regime spent decades positioning as its most powerful weapon has become its most confining prison. The weapon has become the cage. Now let's bring the three-track convergence into the complete analytical picture, because the land corridor's failures are not a separate crisis from the financial blockade and the military confrontation. They are the same crisis expressing itself simultaneously across three interconnected tracks that are compounding each other in ways that make the combined pressure greater than any single track could produce independently. Financial track. The naval blockade has stopped cargo movement through Iranian ports since April 13. 3,000 containers are stuck at Karachi and Gwadar. The land corridor moves cargo at 10 to 12 times maritime cost, amplifying financial drain rather than relieving it. 5 to 6 million liters of subsidized fuel hemorrhage across the border daily through informal routes, depleting state stockpiles without generating state revenue. The whey has frozen Iranian assets in Gulf banking, cutting the IRG's shadow financial networks. Bread lines have formed in Tehran and Isfahan. Farmers cannot reach markets. Industrial raw material transport has nearly halted. Labor unions are calling strikes. The financial clock is running at maximum pressure and the land corridor is adding cost faster than it is generating relief. Military track. The Fujairah pipeline has permanently invalidated the Hormuz threat against whey oil exports. Over 120 Iranian naval vessels have been destroyed since February 28. Fast attack boats are being sunk by Apaches and Seahawks. The IRG's coastal defense infrastructure has been rendered operationally irrelevant against tankers that have rerouted to Fujairah. The BLA threatens every node of the official land corridor. The United States maintains the capability to close the land corridor with a single bridge strike in eastern Iranian territory whenever the strategic calculation changes. The military track is running and the land corridor exists entirely within the space that American decision-making has chosen to permit rather than deny. Internal collapse track. The truck driver workforce is approaching the breaking point that produced 40 city strikes in 2025. The IRG cannot control the border and is filing reports to Tehran that acknowledge the smuggling has overwhelmed its enforcement capacity. Pakistan is extracting maximum value from Iran's dependence while maintaining its relationships with Iran's adversaries simultaneously. The regime is dependent on a neighbor it spent years belittling for the logistic survival that it is marketing as a strategic victory. And the domestic population that the internet shutdown is supposed to keep from understanding the full picture is watching bread lines form and industrial output stall and fuel disappear across the border on motorcycles while the regime tells them the blockade has been broken. All three tracks are converging on the same threshold and the land corridor, far from providing relief, is adding new pressure dimensions to all three simultaneously. Here is the complete and honest strategic assessment of where the land corridor leaves the Islamic Republic of Iran. The regime needed the land corridor to prevent the storage ceiling from forcing well shutdowns and the physical destruction of productive capacity that no subsequent deal could easily reverse. The land corridor's throughput at current cost and logistics constraints is insufficient to prevent that ceiling from approaching on the timeline that existing storage calculations describe. The corridor costs 10 to 12 times as much per unit as maritime trade, meaning every relief dollar the corridor generates costs $10 to $12 of logistics expense to produce. The smuggling explosion removes 5 to 6 million liters per day from state-controlled stockpiles without generating state revenue, simultaneously depleting the reserves the land corridor is supposed to protect and destroying the IRG's claimed border security. Pakistan is using Iran's desperation to strengthen its own regional position, deepen CPEC infrastructure, generate transit revenue, reduce Baluchistan and instability through cheap fuel, and maintain relationships with American and Gulf partners who are applying the blockade pressure Iran needs Pakistan to relieve. The BLA is targeting the exact geographic nodes the official routes must pass through and has both the capability and the stated intention to conduct sustained operations against corridor infrastructure. The truck driver workforce is being pushed beyond the breaking point that it demonstrated in 2025 without any of the conditions that produced the previous breaking point being resolved. The United States has chosen to allow the corridor to operate in conditions that amplify Iranian financial drain while retaining the capability to close it entirely through Pakistani diplomatic pressure or a single bridge strike in eastern Iranian territory. And the Fujairah pipeline has permanently removed the strait closure threat as an instrument of leverage against whey oil exports, turning the waterway from Iran's weapon into Iran's cage where its own oil rots in filling tanks while whey crude flows freely to international markets. The IRG said it broke the blockade. The motorcycles are still crossing the desert, carrying fuel the regime cannot stop from leaving. The containers are still stuck at Karachi and Gwadar. The wells are still approaching their shutdown threshold. And the land bridge that was supposed to be salvation may go down in history as the new front that confirmed the trap had already closed completely before the regime finished celebrating its escape. The regime cannot stop the motorcycles. It cannot control the border. It cannot make the land corridor cheap enough to replace maritime trade. It cannot secure the routes from the blah. It cannot retain its truck driver workforce without concessions it cannot afford. It cannot close the Fujairah pipeline. It cannot stop the storage tanks from filling. And it cannot tell its own population the truth about any of this because the internet is shut down specifically to prevent that conversation from happening at scale. The motorcycles are still moving across the Baluchistan desert. The dust clouds are visible in the footage that is making its way out despite the shutdown, and the IRG commanders who told the world they broke the blockade are still filing reports to Tehran asking Pakistan to help with the motorcycles. Drop your predictions in the comments. Will the land corridor save the regime, or will it go down in history as the escape route that was already a trap before the regime entered it? And what happens to a regime whose greatest recent strategic victory is motorcycle convoys on desert roads while its oil wells approach shutdown and its enemy controls the sea? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The motorcycles are still moving. The tanks are still filling. The answers to those questions are being written right now in the dust clouds rising from the Baluchistan desert. We will see you in the next one.